Aloha, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session, Global Queer Anti-Occupation Activism. My name is Kēhaulani Kauanui, and I'm really happy to have been asked to chair this session. It was put together by the conference organizer, Sarah Schulman, and I just want to thank you for all the work you've done to pull everybody together, and to all the organizers and volunteers. I know a lot of labor has gone into this meeting. We'll have the people go in the order in which they appear on the program. I know some people are hopping around. And I'll go ahead and read bios in between presentations, immediately before each person speaks. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that we're on Lenape Indigenous territory, and I want to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Lenape peoples. And I'm saying plural in this sense because, as I understand it, the Lenape people who were removed from Mannahatta, also known as Manhattan, have been reconstituted into 7 different tribal nations as far as Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and various parts of Canada. And I want to acknowledge that, especially in the context of when we're talking about anti-occupation activism. This is a critique that was raised by many different Indigenous activists when Occupy Wall Street took root. And I'm thinking especially of my colleague and friend Joanne Barker, who's a Lenape scholar who writes on a blog called Tequila Sovereign. And she actually questioned the moniker. And I think a lot of times the Indigenous critique of the name Occupy Wall Street gets misheard as politically correct nitpicking, when she was actually making a political and epistemological intervention to actually talk about what it means to revive this concept of occupation without making the linkage to the original colonial settlement and its ties to corporations in the New World. And of course, we know that that is also tied to enslavement. So mahalo to the Lenape people. I'll start by reading Zohar's bio. That'll be the first paper, and I'm reading the bio notes as they were given to me by each person. Zohar Weiman-Kelman was born and raised in West Jerusalem. They completed their PhD in comparative literature at UC Berkeley last summer. Zohar's dissertation, titled "So the Kids Won't Understand: Inherited Futures of Jewish Women Writers," brings together Yiddish and Hebrew poetry from the 1920s with queer theory, lesbian activism, and Jewish historiography to offer alternative genealogies of Jewish culture. Zohar lives and works between San Francisco, Warsaw, Berlin, and Tel Aviv, and will soon be relocating to Toronto. In all these homes, Zohar aims to bring academia, art, and activism, combining anti-Zionism, Jewish diasporism, and queer love and rage. Please help me in welcoming them. And also, if I may ask somebody up there, could you please close that door? We're getting a lot of the feedback from the hallway. Welcome.
Thanks. Can you hear me? I'm extremely happy to be here with all of these people who I love and admire on the panel, and with all of you in the audience. And I'm also extremely aware of everybody who isn't here because I'm always aware of that speaking in academic spaces, but here even more so because we are so tied to multiple communities and projects, and because the conference is sold out, and because it was sold, and because we're in the United States, and all the multiple things that prevented a lot of the people who these issues really touch most directly from participating. So I'm aware of that, and I'm aware of that also as someone with extreme privilege of movement. As you heard from my bio, I'm definitely a self-identified wandering Jew, and moving between countries and between communities, between the Middle East and the US, and between activism and academia. And that entails, a sense of responsibility to be translating and to be bringing things back and forth in all of these spaces. And also no small measure of anxiety of, will I be understood? What is it I'm trying to say? What am I doing here? What are you all doing here? These are sort of the questions that I was thinking about a lot preparing my talk, or having trouble preparing it, not quite knowing exactly what's actually bringing us all together and what we hope to leave with. So I hope I'll open some of those questions, and that we'll open them together. And this whole pinkwashing thing is extremely personal for me, as it is, I think, for many of us. But as a queer Israeli whose body and identity is sort of being enlisted in this, sort of in my name so directly, I feel so compelled to speak about this. And, it reminds me of the way I was enlisted non-consensually into the Israeli army before I was declared insane, finally sanely. But the need, to remove yourself from these nationalist, heteronormative discourses and practices, which is a continuous one. I don't feel like I did it, I'm out, I'm done. So that's also something I want to bring, that continuous work of removing oneself and resituating oneself in the most sort of sensitively attuned and responsible ways possible, and that's a challenge to myself and a challenge I offer to all of us. And I think the other reason I feel really, drawn into these discussions of pinkwashing is that there was sort of a brief window in my personal biography where connecting to queer communities of resistance in Israeli society was the first time where I could even imagine being living in Israel, where I'm from, and being actively, consistently embodying and part of resistance. But that was a pretty small window, because I feel like once the sort of propaganda machine really enlisted Israeli gay identity in this fight, I lost that sense of having queerness as an acute tool of resistance. I don't think it's completely gone, but I think that instant identification with being able to say, I'm queer, I'm not part of this, I really lost that, and that really connects for me with the need that Hanin's keynote brought out of looking for sort of new horizons and new ways of formulating our resistance that may have sort of started as queer, and pinkwashing definitely brought us here together, but where it's not going to end with this queerness, but rather to recenter the discussion around Palestine, and also at the same time around other liberation struggles that are connected to each and every one of us, wherever we may be. And to, as an academic also, to say how exciting it is to have all this queer theory being used in these formulations, and to reiterate that I think it should be a means and not an end, that these aren't just metaphors, and that we're dealing in our own lives, that we hope to actually affect and bring change using theory, and not just publish new books, though we would like to do that too. So now I want to turn to a poem, because that's what I usually do, poetry. And it's a poem by Irina Klepfish. I'll say more soon. So, during the war, Germans were known to pick up infants by their feet, swing them through the air, and smash their heads against plaster walls. Somehow, I managed to escape that fate. Now, this is the opening poem of Irina Klepfish's 1975 book, Keeper of Accounts. And as a survivor of the Chulban, the Yiddish word for the Nazi genocide project, she really is describing a fate that she narrowly escaped by surviving that war. At the same time, the poem is inscribing the fate that she did manage to find, that of a poet. And it's not just in the fact that this poem exists that she brings this into being, but also in the psalm that this poem is invoking. Now, I don't know if it sounds familiar. This is actually coming from a very famous psalm that's where the Israelites sit by the river of Babylon and, question how they can sing the Lord's song in a strange land. But those are not the lines that Klepfish's poem is turning to. Instead, she is invoking these lines that are the song that exile actually produces, which is the Israelites bloody fantasy of revenge, and I'll just quote, "O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones." Now, in Clubfish's poem, the baby killers are the Germans, not the Israelites fantasizing this violence. But later in her poetry, the roles get reversed again as she imagines, in the voice of a Palestinian boy, the comparison of the Israeli soldiers to the German ones. And here, suddenly, the fate that Clubfish managed to avoid is not just the one of victim, but of perpetrator. And in the reality that we now live in, where this early Israelite exilic fantasy has become too close to realized back in Zion. Now, my turn to Clubfish is both diasporic and lesbian at the same time, as she is a vocal advocate of both positions. And we see them really expressed in this 1982 anthology called Nice Jewish Girls, which is a Jewish lesbian anthology. And what's really striking about it is how it expresses, at the same time, negotiating homophobia and anti-Semitism, both realities that I feel like I did not experience as directly, or I can't even imagine experiencing as directly as seems to be a really dominant experience for these earlier Jewish lesbians. And their work that I said I would refer to today and that I will refer to right now, it coalesces in one particular statement by a group called the Vilde Chayes, the wild animals. I'll say more about them. But it's a letter that they produced in response both to the Lebanon War, which they were, of course, against, and the anti-Semitism in the lesbian movement that came up at the same time. And I'll just quote a little bit of that. So they write, "We do not accept the idea that our fight against anti-Semitism robs political energy from our fight against racism. To maintain that all our energy must be devoted to only one of these oppressions is divisive and strategically unsound. Such a single issue position forces us to deny essential parts of our identities and experiences. It also inhibits the forming of coalitions among women of various ethnic, religious, racial, and class background, coalitions which are vital in the fight for freedom and justice." Now, they're responding to a critique that equated Zionism with racism, and there are things in their response that I am very uncomfortable with. For example, they write, "Zionism is one strategy against anti-Semitism for Jewish survival. Any anti-Zionist position is therefore anti-Semitic." Now, I don't agree with that, and I think a lot of them, or at least I would like to believe, of the women undersigned, and they include women like Irina Clubfish, the poet I read from, and Adrienne Rich, Melanie Kay. So some of them really have publicly realigned their position in response, both to having a more dominant Jewish voice on the political scene and becoming more aware of the actual situation in Palestine, Israel. But it's important for me to turn to that political moment, even when, or especially if there are things about it that make me uncomfortable, to try and understand the particular genealogy of Jewish, lesbian, and queer activism. And then that moment between lesbian and queer is also a really significant moment that I think some of people's work here is addressing amidst the many axes that we're navigating and trying to formulate coalitions and politics. And a group that addressed that directly is a second group that I mentioned in my title, Kvisa, Shcora, Black Laundry, who have been mentioned. And like the Vilde Chayes mean wild animals in Yiddish, and that's sort of taking a derogatory term and making it positive. The Black Laundry is doing the same, playing on black sheep and airing the dirty laundry, this time in Hebrew and not in Yiddish. I don't want to go into detail about them because I think sort of people know about their work, and also it has been to a certain extent over-valorized and sort of overused for what it was. And one part of that really is the way it is speaking from a particular moment of Israeli privilege to get to be able to, make that utterance and to use that voice, and that is a privilege that I also use. You know, I am not afraid to be accused of anti-Semitism. Since I have no time, let me see. So looking at both of these moments together, briefly, I think we can start to tease out the different ways we position ourselves, and that also ask about the role that the Jewish question and the queer and lesbian question are playing in this particular movement and particular moment. And I think these are really vital and super sensitively delicate questions that I myself don't know how to answer, and I'm also sort of afraid of bringing them up, but that's kind of why I'm doing it, in the sense of completely agreeing that we should be moving to a place that is foregrounding the liberation of Palestine and liberation in general, while asking how it is that Jewish movements and individuals have been such a big part of this group, and also asking why this queer moment brought this explosion that we're seeing. I don't think we would be here, like I said, without it today. So how to move beyond these moments that have driven a lot of our conversation to kind of question the motivations and question the goals to be able to formulate a different strategy. And that's where I want to return to the wild animals of Vilde Chayes' strategy of making all of the connections at the intersections of oppression, together with an invitation and a call to look back at our histories, at our radical ancestors, at our less radical ancestors, and to be attuned to sort of how quickly history shifts and how delicate our position within it can be or should be, to make sure that we're able to formulate a politics for a future that we can't even quite imagine yet. So that's it for now.
Our next presentation will be by Dean Spade. Spade is an associate professor at the Seattle University School of Law and is currently a fellow in the Engaging Tradition Project at Columbia Law School, where he is currently teaching a class on law and occupation. In 2002, he founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit collective that provides free legal help to low-income people and people of color who are trans, intersex, and/or gender nonconforming, and works to build trans resistance rooted in racial and economic justice. He is the author of a book titled Normal Life: Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm really glad to be here also. I've really enjoyed people's papers, so thanks to everybody who's been putting out great ideas and lots to chew on. So I wanted to just think a little bit about, some of the things we came to the conference to think about, how we get to this point where military service and marriage, two key apparatuses of colonization and racialized violence, become the symbols of equality and democracy in these pinkwashing campaigns, right? And particularly how gay and lesbian rights is a space where you can see this really amazing trajectory of a kind of a split off strain, extremely conservative strain of a movement that operates very effectively to contain and neutralize and sets up the conditions where those narratives can be so available for the pinkwashing campaign and can be effective and can make sense to people on a gut level in a way that makes them work as a campaign to the extent that they do. And so I want to kind of think out what kinds of thinking makes this work and what the common sense of homonationalism is a bit in the context of the U.S., especially where I live, and sort of how that kind of common sense has happened, where gay rights rhetoric cleanses and rehabilitates apparatuses of racial and colonial violence like marriage, the military, and policing. And so specifically today, I want to think about how, for me, prison abolition praxis and analysis has been a useful resource for trying to think otherwise. And I think this also might be helpful for us in terms of understanding relationships between projects of analyzing and dismantling anti-Black racism and settler colonialism and the way that those projects have a relationship to the nation-state form. So I don't have time to tell you these two stories I want to tell you that help set this up, so I'm going to give you like the most brief. So one that I wanted to tell you was about when a Pinkwashing tour came to Seattle, and a bunch of us responded to it and got some events canceled. And I wanted to tell you about these kind of conversations I had with people. The most disturbing ones were with folks who see themselves as critical of Israel, don't see themselves as Zionists, and see themselves as critical of gay marriage, and still were like, this is terrible. It's always good when same-sex marriage happens anywhere, or gays are in the military anywhere. Those are victories. It's not okay to critique those things. It's not okay to try to not have those events. So they were like, simultaneously had so much shared analysis up to a certain point, and then this other, departure where they really were attached to this sort of, that gay marriage and gays in the military in Israel is a victory for all gays everywhere, and we should have events in here about it. And then the other story I wanted to tell you about is about how in Seattle they're trying to tear down the youth jail that exists and rebuild the jail, and they're building it as a center for family justice, for child and kid, youth and family justice. And there's the whole framework about how it's going to have like tons of social services in it. It's going to be really great. And they're going to have the child welfare system is also going to be centered there, where people get their kids taken away from them, primarily Black and Native people. And the new rooms where it's going to happen are going to be really private. It's going to be really great. And so there's kind of this huge delight about this new jail from reformers, and there's a group of us who are trying to get them to just close the existing jail and not build a new one. And I wanted to kind of tell you about the ways that people react to that, the ways that reformers whose lives are spent entirely understanding the violence of those systems still think that a jail needs to exist for kids, and kind of what that investment is. So kind of people who travel up to the edge with us and then in the end really want to build a new jail where they will get to go and work as advocates for youth. So I want to just kind of give you guys a few features of abolitionist analysis and strategy that I think might be relevant to and helpful for thinking about anti-pinkwashing work. And when I say abolition, I mean abolition of all imprisonment, including immigration imprisonment, medical and psychiatric imprisonment, and criminal imprisonment, just in case that's not clear. Okay, so a couple of these features. One, abolitionist thinking and strategy rejects declared historical breaks. So in the story that abolitionists tell, which I hope you all know by now, that about the ways in which contemporary mass imprisonment that's racially targeted is actually part of a trajectory of slavery, and the kind of rejection of the idea that slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, and that, anti-Black racism ended with civil rights laws, right? So this kind of rejection of these declared historical breaks, these nationally declared historical breaks. People make the same analysis about the child welfare system, that it's, you can see this in Dorothy Roberts' work, that it's a continuation of slavery, that these that these things didn't end, that they changed form. And part of this analysis of rejecting the declared historical breaks is about identifying like a fundamental nature of the U.S. legal system, that it's racist, that it's a system of slavery, and that it's not, those things aren't incidental to it nor resolvable, and that it's not as if we could properly read the U.S. Constitution and then get rid of all the racism and colonialism and heteropatriarchy, right? So this is a very key thing. It's a demystification and a release of the fantasy of those pieces. And one other piece of this is an awareness that oftentimes reforms just produce more and more legal mechanisms that continue to produce the same violence. I'm thinking about the work of Colin Diane in her book, The Law is a White Dog, talking about after the prison reform movement, lots of prison reform litigation in the 70s and 80s, you actually just see more detailed laws that like sanction and cordon off the continued torture of people in prison. So the ways in which, and I think, obviously, I hope your mind is jumping to the ways in which systems of Israeli apartheid are like more and more and more law to produce these forms of containment and violence. Okay, so that's one feature. Another feature is abolitionists focusing on understanding imprisonment as population control and refusing ways of thinking about imprisonment that are about individual rights or individual culpability. And kind of really rejecting and criticizing ideas around danger and security, the notion of the terrorist or the serial killer who really belongs in prison, the kind of individualized narratives. Abolitionists understand those as justifying a total control or lockdown that's racially targeted and has nothing to do with individual dangerousness, which is a really key move. Similarly, there's a deep critique around reforms that suggest that somebody's experience in the system will be fixed, that we could have a reform and then someone won't have that kind of most obvious torture anymore. So if we just get out of prison the people who've been proven innocent on DNA evidence, then the system's okay. You know, that kind of let's find the most obvious contradiction and resolve it. A third feature of abolitionist analysis strategy is refusing to pick out sympathetic or charismatic victims, right? So refusing to separate the population to those who, who really belong in and those who don't. So innocent people or nonviolent people. These kind of frameworks, and it really rang with me yesterday when Haneen was talking about, she asked the question, are you in solidarity with queer Palestinians or with Palestine, right? So that the kind of refusal to separate off those who are, for some reason, deserving empathy or something. A next feature is refusing to believe what the system says about itself. So laws and policies, of course, in the context of criminalization are never enforced as they're written. And so trying to change what's written down about them, right, is this kind of fruitless thing that we're encouraged to continue to do. And it's one of the features inside abolition is like refusing to fight for the system to say different things about us or what our experience will be like with the police or in prisons or what will happen, but instead to actually dismantle the system itself, right? So that refusal to sort of believe what the system says about itself. Hate crimes laws are an obvious example. The critique around hate crimes laws is an obvious example of this. Another feature is the desire to make immediate change, to provide immediate relief while not engaging in reforms that expand or legitimize violence. So imagining non-reformist reforms is the way a lot of people talk about it in abolition circles. Like instead of trying to build a trans prison, which is a common example, comes up in my work, people are like, we need to build a trans prison. Instead trying to get trans people out of prison by decriminalizing sex work or stopping building new prisons, things like that. So that kind of question, which again echoes with Haneen's question yesterday, can anti-pinkwashing activism be radical and not a reform strategy? A next feature is the process of thinking about leadership really reflectively. So in abolition work, people are engaged in really consistent self-reflection and critique about leadership, prioritizing those who are most impacted by criminalization, developing ideas about what ally roles exist, but recognizing the kind of complexity around that, and particularly looking at the dangers of how prison research and the ways that academic fields and helping professions constitute themselves through perpetuating and managing apparatuses of violence. So this is, I think, particularly significant to us as academics talking about occupation in the United States today. So this is inside abolition. We're always asking who is speaking and why, and being really committed to the analysis and demands of the most impacted people, especially imprisoned scholars and activists. Another feature is refusing to limit our analysis of the situation to the state. Right? So the term prison industrial complex, the reason anti-prison activists use that term is because it's about understanding the prison privatization and the ways that criminalization is managed and produced and expanded by corporations and by NGOs and by reformers, and how prison culture defines and shapes all of us in really fundamental ways, so that campaigns that, might target particular governmental actors, but our work is sort of everywhere, right? It's including inside ourselves, which is a really important part of this, in part because it causes us to consistently look at organizational norms. Like, if we're trying to make a new world in the organizations that we're forming or in the ways that we're studying and understanding imprisonment, we ask, how are the norms and the forms of the existing systems manifesting in our work? And in what ways? And we take how we do the work extremely seriously, not just a goal or a demand. And the most important final feature I'll talk about is that prison abolition is a project that is considered impossible. And I would say the same might be true of a meaningful elimination of settler colonialism, right? It's something that people are told we are not allowed to imagine or to expect. Or to work toward. And I think in both these projects, we are naming aims and goals that are actually illegible to racist, colonial, heteropatriarchal culture, law, and media, and imagining a world without prisons and borders, or imagining actual decolonization and the abolition of settler colonialism are both extremely difficult to imagine because of the way these forces shape our own abilities to think and our own imaginations, but they're also simultaneously not difficult to imagine at all, since, of course, like, if the U.S. is the most imprisoning country that the world has ever seen, everything that's ever happened has been an alternative, right? And certainly, most people across all of time lived without the nation state. Like, the nation state is like 5 minutes ago, right? So that can be useful, I think, for us when we are told that what we imagine is impossible. And I think particularly when we're trying to imagine like decolonization or also like post-apartheid frameworks, the places that are held out as places where these things have been resolved, particularly often the US and South Africa, require a great deal of suspicion, since we know that they are places of extreme wild inequality and racial violence, and that the lies of sort of democracy and legal equality are held up by the promises of these places' meaningless constitutions. And we see that the processes towards the resolution of these claims are actually processes that facilitate rather than resolve the violence, and have produced new/old forms of exploitation and violence, changing sort of the surface structure or the story it tells about itself, but really having quite familiar forms of distribution. So abolition work, including queer and trans abolition work, thank you, has been a really key space for me for learning about thinking past fantasies of law, recognition, and equality, and confronting apparatuses of racialized and gender violence as something to dismantle rather than something to seek inclusion in, which I think is like this really big problem for why pinkwashing like works on some people, right? Is because this is hard for people to know about. And I think it's a really useful analysis in the face of a pinkwashing strategy based on the notion that queer and trans liberation can be delivered by settler colonial states if their legal codes say that lesbian and gay and maybe trans people can serve in their militaries or marry. Abolition analysis and practice is also useful because of really material realities of imprisonment being a key strategy of colonial violence in all of these places, right? In Canada and the US and Israel. And the same prison and security profiteers often building and managing the prisons and borders across all these three countries too. So it's like very materially meaningful for us to try to figure out how we can blend these ways of thinking and these different mobilized constituencies. I think that there's a necessity for us to make all of our movements anti-criminalization, anti-punishment, and anti-colonial movements. And that's a really big deal. And when you don't do that, you see what happened in the stories at the beginning, where like people have dedicated their lives to like youth who are criminalized, still can't imagine that we don't need a youth jail. Like when you don't build an anti-criminalization movement, when the rubber hits the road, we can't actually, right? It can't be the transitions can't happen. And so I think we need to be really actively struggling for what any of those things mean, what it means to be an anti-criminalization, anti-punishment, anti-colonial movement, what the world we're trying to build means, and like having really productive, important arguments about that as we do, and working hard to kind of imagine what we've been told is actually impossible to imagine or impossible to happen or unimaginable.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mikki Steider. Steider is a PhD candidate at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. Her research focuses on pinkwashing, questions of rights and recognition, queer and critical race theory and praxis, and social justice in the geopolitical context of Palestine-Israel. She holds an MA in both cultural analysis and theater studies. In November 2012, she took part in Queer Visions at the World Social Forum, Free Palestine. This initiative brought together activists from around the globe to work on transnational anti-pinkwashing projects. She currently works in Montreal as a visiting researcher in the Feminist Movements and Social Media Project at Concordia University. Welcome.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. I'm very honored and nervous also of sharing the panel with these amazing people. And what I'll be sharing with you today are really some preliminary thoughts that I'm working on for my PhD research. And it's really one of the first chapters that I'll be writing, so bear with me. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts afterwards. I want to start today with a quote from pinkwashingisrael.com. For those of you who don't know the website, please go check it out. It's amazing. It's one of the media outlets of anti-pinkwashing work. So here comes the quote. If we as activists are working towards social, economic, and political justice, then we must decouple calls for rights from an identitarian prism of understanding what those rights are and resist the project to anchor all politics within the axis of identity. Pinkwashing, it is not about gay rights at all. The trap of global anti-pinkwashing debates is that they still too often rely on a neutral gay-state bond in an attempt to redress the way in which gay rights are instrumentalized to legitimate and legitimize Israel's state violence. Although there is an increased willingness to recognize pinkwashing as a cynical branding campaign on a global scale, Israel's gay rights record is congruently being posited as neutral untouchable, and even worth celebrating. However, I think a quite simple but necessary question is, what are we actually celebrating? Jasper Puar and Maya Mikdashi remind us that this lauding of Israel's gay rights record, quote unquote, reproduces the very discourse of pinkwashing in its attempts to redress it, by treating gay rights as if they operate in a legal vacuum, separate and separable from the legal system as a whole. In other words, there exists an a priori consensus that we can and should distinguish between bad uses of gay rights, which would be pinkwashing, and on the other hand, good uses of gay rights that serve to protect LGBT people in Israel and/or Palestine or anywhere else against violence. This distinction continues not only to perpetuate the idea that gay rights operate independent of global circuits of neoliberalism, homonationalism, imperialism, and colonialism, but also perpetuates the reification of a particular white gay male subject within these terms. Activists and scholars, and many of whom are here today, and also especially on this panel, question whether contemporary gay rights discourse can significantly address the violence faced by queer communities, in this case predominantly in the context of the United States. They raise the concern that liberal gay rights discourse effaces other subject positions and perpetuates forms of structural violence that affect the poor, trans people, and queer people of color specifically. A similar thing is happening within the context of pinkwashing. I think it's important to understand that it's not just a cynical branding campaign, but it's highly embedded in both legal and representational systems of subjugation, particular to its colonial present. For this paper, I therefore do not want to analyze what the pinkwashing machine is, the use and celebration of gay rights to disguise Israel's ongoing occupation, apartheid, and colonialism, and in conjunction the portrayal of Arabs as collectively homophobic and therefore backward. Rather, I scrutinize the double bind that anti-pinkwashing activists face between responding to incitement to discourse around sexuality, gayness, and gay rights, as argued by Jasper Puar and Joseph Mossad, amongst others, and the necessity to create and recognize a scene of speaking that resists the former. I do this by focusing on the discourse created by Palestinian queer activist groups, specifically Al-Qaus and Palestinian Queers for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, who continuously dismiss gay rights discourse as a frame of reference. For today, I want to zoom in on this particular disruption of incitement to discourse through the declaration, pinkwashing, it is not about gay rights. Not only do Palestinian queer activists argue that pinkwashing and gay rights hijack Palestinian queer voices and obscure daily realities, they simultaneously offer a significantly different outlook on queer struggle as a politics that does not single out sexuality and/or gender in its articulations and interventions, which again became very clear in yesterday's talk, in which anti-pinkwashing work was specifically described as a project of decolonization. I am particularly interested in the way in which this fledgling discourse addresses and resists the precarious non-positions that pinkwashing and the Zionist project sustain. As the title of my presentation suggests, we need to ask what happens when it is not about gay rights. With it, I'm simultaneously invoking pinkwashing, queer politics, and solidarity. Instead of asking why it's not about gay rights, I would like to start from these premises. By asking this, I hope to trail a mode of thought that articulates other responses to violence and will lead us elsewhere. Responses that both understand the necessity of rights-based struggle on the one hand, especially in terms of the colonized Palestinian people whose rights have been systematically denied to them, and on the other hand, remain wary of reproducing structures of power and domination through its very form. There are three questions that are of interest to me here. First, can we have the pinkwashing conversation outside of the salon of gay rights and sexual solidarity? If so, what other modes of belonging, recognition, politics, and solidarity become possible? And last, how can we rethink forms of resistance that articulate a more ambiguous relationship towards a language of rights? In a recent lecture at the World Social Forum Free Palestine, Hanin Maiki describes the politicization of the Palestinian queer movement, quote unquote. In 2007, we understood that being Palestinian queers is actually also being an active political group that has analyses, a complicated analysis that addresses the struggle of Palestinian society in all its layers. This is our major task and vision, and not gay rights or identity politics or struggles of acceptance. We don't want anyone to accept us. End of quote. Radically declaring we don't want anyone to accept us reorientates attention from acceptance as the answer to oppression to an analysis of the structural violence underlying acceptance narratives. As Judith Butler describes, to be addressed or interpolated in a certain way, and in this case through a language of gay rights, quote unquote, constitutes a being within the possible circuit of recognition and accordingly outside of it in abjection, end of quote. Gay rights do not follow the call of the subject, but are rather inaugurative of particular subject positions and non-positions embedded in imperial racist ideologies. Palestinian queer activists problematize the way in which these parameters of recognition constitute them as either hyper-visible victims of their own society's alleged homophobia or erotic objects of desire in Orientalist fashion. Thank you. The trap of pinkwashing is exactly that it makes Palestinian queers legible only through a gay rights ideology that establishes a euphemistic relationship between Israelis and Palestinians as that between the liberated savior and the oppressed weak victim, instead of understanding this relationship in its material reality as fundamentally colonial. Furthermore, acceptance narratives in Israel circulate predominantly around the desire to be fully integrated into Israel's military-industrial complex and institutes of marriage complicit in Israel's demographic war. The struggle for LGBT equality can be understood as a struggle within the borders of a settler colonial society whose preconditions for access to full citizenship are exclusively available to Jewish Israelis, remaining well inside the parameters of the settler colonial Zionist project, which is based on the expulsion, effacement, and dispossession of Palestinians and Palestinian land. Gay rights discourse thus inherently normalizes the actual power dynamics between colonizer and colonized. Sorry, it's really dry in this room. Although anti-pinkwashing work addresses the way in which gay communities are instrumentalized and complicit to the Zionist project, it would be misleading to assume that the attempt is to invent new forms of sexual solidarity with Palestinian queers. And Dean just repeated right now and what Haneen said yesterday about the fact that are we in solidarity with Palestinian queers or are we in solidarity with decolonizing Palestine? Anti-pinkwashing work dissects the way in which communities at large are invited to participate in Israel's creation of a modern backward binary produced within contemporary Zionism and global circuits of Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment. Palestinian queer groups stipulate that anti-pinkwashing is not about the good or bad relationship between gay people and their states or non-states, but about how this unfolds into a sexual politics understood as the regulation of bodies, affects, identifications, and desires to further the Zionist project of exclusive Jewish sovereignty. Instead of orienting towards the good and bad uses of gay rights, anti-pinkwashing work attempts to resist this particular regulation of equality, political subjectivities, and forms of recognition mired in Israel's occupation, apartheid, and colonialism. In anti-pinkwashing work, nation-states appear as fields of injury rather than inclusion. This ambiguous relation to the nation-state as a construct foregrounds the grassroots liberation and sovereignty of the Palestinian people and not necessarily a homogenized Palestinian nation-state. By repeatedly declaring pinkwashing is not about gay rights, anti-pinkwashing work produces a disidentification from and indifference to gay rights ideology, destabilizing its epistemological claims. By disconnecting rights from their identitarian incarnations, anti-pinkwashing work initiates a decolonization of a language of rights distributed differentially and rooted in neoliberalism, Zionism, and colonialism. Pinkwashing is not a marginal phenomenon that only targets gay communities. It is positioned as one of the central mechanisms of the contemporary Zionist campaign to divert attention from the occupation. Its mechanisms functioning particularly well within a larger context of the regulation of sexual, affective, and political subjectivities and forms of citizenship proliferating within the context of the War on Terror. At the General Assembly at the World Social Forum Free Palestine, one of the main goals was therefore to, quote-unquote, identify pinkwashing as one of the main strategies used by the Israeli state and its supporters to divert attention away from the oppression of the Palestinian people, end of quote. The larger Palestinian liberation struggle and global solidarity activists are asked to include the pinkwashing analysis in order to comprehensively struggle against the occupation. To position this struggle as a queer one reimagines a queer politics that promotes decolonizing efforts through understanding the complexity and multiplicity of how power works, instead of understanding itself as another perspective from the margin. The anti-colonial and anti-racist narratives ingrained in anti-pinkwashing work reveal how gay rights and liberal rights discourses further produce instances of subjugation and control, particular to Israel's occupation and apartheid. To understand this is central to the resistance movement, forces us as academics, activists, critics, and others to move away from criticizing the instrumentalization of gay rights and demand the rejection of this frame altogether in the pursuit of radical forms of equality. Where the gay rights discourse seeks to distribute its project through its identifications, the Palestinian queer movement and its performative indifference to gay rights imagines an alternative queer politics and solidarity that challenge hegemonic understandings of struggles for recognition. By defining a queer politics outside a liberal language of gay rights, sexual solidarity, and liberal human rights, they refuse to respond to the dominant discourse that has changed nothing in the material reality of Palestinian daily life. Instead, anti-pinkwashing work offers a critique of how, the pinkwashing project is sustained by the reification of a particular subject of rights, the gay subject, who erases other forms of rights-based struggle that are more wary of the liberalism of its discourse. Anti-pinkwashing work reveals the way in which rights-based struggles have been liberalized and co-opted to sustain state violence rather than oppose it. The rejection of gay rights as a frame of reference disrupts the arrangements of pinkwashing within the Zionist project. Instead of reiterating a binary between good and bad uses of gay rights, the transformative discourse created by the Palestinian queer movement offers a way out of the double bind I elaborated in the beginning. The rejection of gay rights functions as a moment of disorientation that allows for other forms of attachment and detachment to take place. It seeks to reimagine the question of rights and social justice through a decolonized queer lens without reifying a particular queer subject. In this particular queer lens lies the potential, to use the words of Sara Ahmed, to quote-unquote disturb the order of things. As pinkwashing and the Zionist project are sustained through the continued abjection and displacement of Palestinians, we must perhaps think of this loss of place not only as a site for the creation of precarious non-positions, but also as a site where alternative and resistant modes of belonging and collectivity can take place. As, quote-unquote, the world is shaped by some bodies more than others, end of quote, we need to resist the ongoing injuries performed by the differential distribution of so-called equality. Whenever we talk about gay rights in Israel, we talk about pinkwashing and vice versa. Articulating the two as interchangeable allows for a closer scrutiny of the biopolitics of the occupation that has hijacked right-based struggles to its own colonial advantage. Anti-pinkwashing work seeks to resist models of dialogue, normalization, and negotiation, and instead proposes a decolonization of rights-based discourses that the peace process, narratives of coexistence, and gay internationalists attempt to stall. Last sentence. To start from here, then, necessitates different forms of recognition, solidarity, and struggle. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Natalie Kouri-Towe. Kouri-Towe is a PhD candidate in the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto, OISE, and the Collaborative Program in Women and Gender Studies. Her dissertation examines the emergence of transnational queer Palestine solidarity activism and theorizes the politics of solidarity. Rooted in feminist and queer frameworks, her work also considers how theories on affect can introduce new possibilities for thinking about social and political transformation. She is an organizing member of the Toronto-based group Queers Against Israeli Apartheid and is chair of the board of directors for the Toronto-based arts, culture, and politics publication, Fuse Magazine. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me like this? Yeah? Okay, good. So Queers Against Israeli Apartheid formed in 2008 in Toronto. That summer, a group of activists under the banner of QAIA, which is the acronym for Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, marched for the first time in the Toronto Pride Parade. The following year, on the 27th of May 2009, the National Post newspaper incorrectly reported that QAIA had been banned from the annual Pride Parade, marking the beginnings of the debates about QAIA's inclusion at Pride. Since 2009, the annual attempt to have QAIA banned from Toronto's Pride Parade has been shaped by the interventions of numerous actors, including City of Toronto officials, politicians, lobbyists, public and private funders, journalists, and public figures. Beyond the lobbying efforts to have Kwaya banned, however, emerged another set of interventions into the debates about Kwaya and the words Israeli apartheid in particular at the space of Pride, which centered on discourses of queer belonging and sexual citizenship. These debates, which circulated throughout Toronto's queer press extra, on social media sites and other public forums, were articulated primarily through concerns over the hijacking of Pride by the politics of the Middle East and debates over whether Pride is political. Ostensibly, these debates were concerned with the terms of queer belonging and community in Toronto's Pride Parade. However, underlying these narratives of community and belonging are a series of practices that emerged through neoliberalism, which enmesh sexual subjects in the violent project of nation building. In the short time I have today, I want to briefly trace some of the local struggles of Kwaya's battle for inclusion at Toronto Pride. However, my goal is to trace some of the urgencies of tracking local practices of how nation states, such as Israel, Canada, and the US, deploy sexual rights in the sanctioning of violence and militarism, which is not simply an interruption into the instrumentalization of queer subjects by the nation state, but foundationally a question of how to mobilize in opposition to these practices through social movement building. Specifically, I'm concerned with how hegemonic discourses of sexual liberation structure the terms of sexual subjectivity and citizenship in ways that risk constraining or undoing the possibilities of transnational solidarity. And here, this paper is very much in line with my fellow panelists. By the spring of 2010, after 2 years of pressuring Pride Toronto and its public and private funders, pro-Israel lobbyists succeeded in having Kwaya banned from the Pride Parade. On the 21st of May 2010, news was leaked that the board of directors of Pride Toronto had made a decision to ban the term Israeli apartheid from the parade that year, effectively banning the group through its name and messaging. The ban was lifted just days before the parade, but as Kwaya's controversy climaxed in the ban, queers and non-queers alike debated the inclusion of Kwaya at Pride. These debates about Kwaya's inclusion were predicated on a particular shift in the discourses of sexual rights and belonging through the debate about Kwaya's right to march. In subsequent years, attempts to ban Kwaya from Pride have manifested in a series of tactics, including lobbying attempts at City Hall to defund Pride, changes to the language of the municipal anti-discrimination policy in Toronto, which is in the process of happening right now, and the institution of a legally binding arbitration process at Toronto Pride called the dispute resolution process to adjudicate on groups that are deemed, respectful of those anti-discrimination policies. All these sites mobilized a particular kind of neoliberalization of rights discourses, which required more than just simply a rhetorical slip, but an elision of the structures of power at play. As such, the flattening of hierarchies of power and circulation across Israeli state practices and critiques of the term Israeli apartheid are not simply tactics, but central ruling logics in the language of Israeli state nation building through its public relations campaign and shifts in logics defending state violence. For Lisa Dugan's work, one of neoliberalism's greatest successes is the illusion of political neutrality. As Dugan argues, that neoliberalism accomplishes this by giving the appearance of a mainstream through the triangulation of extreme politics on the right and left. In June 2012, 6 complaints were filed against Kwaya at Pride through the dispute resolution process. Only 1 complaint went to arbitration, filed by B'nai B'rith Canada. And on June 29, 2012, the dispute resolution panel ruled in their arbitration decision in favor of Kwaya, so the group was allowed to march. However, despite the victory for the group to once again march in the parade, the continual requirements to speak to the neoliberal terms of sexual citizenship and proper belonging produced a conundrum for solidarity gestures, like those of Kwaya. In order to mobilize its politic of Palestine solidarity through the space of Pride, Kwaya had to appeal to the very language of inclusion under the project of nation building that the group aimed to resist. Further, Kwaya's participation in the dispute resolution process solidified the role of this DRP as a neutral arbiter and reinstated the very terms of neoliberal triangulation that posited Kwaya as a threat to Pride in the first place. This requirement to speak to the language of neoliberalism raises a series of concerns for the possibilities of transnational solidarity and movement building more generally. National recognition for sexual rights requires a visible out sexual subject, as we see primarily in the figure of the white gay male kind of archetype. As visibility becomes the model for sexual citizenship, only those sexual subjects who mirror this model are granted recognition within the space or in spaces like Pride. According to Amal Amire, Palestinian queers are marked by two extremes, hypervisibility and invisibility. Like Amire's articulation of the paradox of queer Palestinian visibility within Israeli narratives, the figure of the queer Palestinian in Kwaya's controversy at Toronto Pride was marked by the politics of visibility and invisibility when Toronto's crisis over the words Israeli apartheid called upon the figure of the queer Palestinian to defend Kwaya's use of the term. Despite Kwaya's attempts to remain ambivalent about the call to speak to the authenticity of the queer Palestinian subject as a legitimate suffering other, the group nonetheless was obliged to speak on behalf of this figure in defense of its claim to queer solidarity. Despite the tactical necessity of this movement, the mobilization of a fictionalized solidarity object to defend Kwaya pulled the gesture of solidarity back into the terms of neoliberal discourses, into the recognizable subjectivity through an out-gay Palestinian subject. Activist negotiations of neoliberal logics raise a series of questions about the terms and possibilities for transnational solidarity. How do transnational solidarity activists deploy their political interventions without reproducing a fantasy figure or a fetish figure in their solidarity work? This question requires some reflection on the terms of solidarity, the mobilization of figures in social movements and solidarity movements in particular, and the fragile line between maneuvering across neoliberal logics and building political platforms for movement building. When solidarity activists were called upon to defend their interventions by demonstrating the reality of the suffering of the others through visible and recognizable forms of sexual citizenship, we risk a lot. For instance, in the case of Kwaya, the reliance on representational models of queer visibility risks producing Palestinians as token native informants. This does not mean that queer solidarity necessarily tokenizes, but that the impulse to do so is already scripted into the language of neoliberal logics that structure solidarity interventions in these kinds of moments. As Gada Marous argues in her work on photographic practices of witnessing in international solidarity activism, the white Western liberal desire to mediate the suffering of others risks reinstating unequal power relations in empathetic representation. Through the neoliberalizing frameworks of homonational sexual citizenship, queer solidarity activists are also at risk of a similar ethical dilemma in the representation of this figure of queer Palestinians. By speaking exclusively to the language of visibility structured by neoliberalism, solidarity activists risk reproducing the civilizational impulses of mapping a legible, recognizable subject for solidarity predicated on the terms of neoliberal citizenship of homonationalism. So these practices translate the gesture of solidarity with Palestine into moments that produce and construct figures of ideal solidarity objects. And here I'm making this distinction between a figure called, queer Palestinian, which is a fictional fetish object that gets circulated within Western discourses that call on these movements to speak to the reality and authenticity of claims of activism, in juxtaposition to basically to extend in the place of the collective movements of Palestinian liberation more broadly, and in particular Palestinian queers more specifically as mobilized by activist interventions like groups like Palestinian Queers for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, and Al-Qaus and Aswat. So the impulse to reveal a coherent object of solidarity is strong in transnational activism, where the problem of proximity requires some form of representation in order to make claims to injustice. However, the production of the figure of the queer Palestinian as a fictional object plays into the discursive tactics of Israeli pinkwashing discourses of Palestinian victimization in Arab culture and draws solidarity attention away from the larger project of Palestine liberation by slipping into a defense of queer Palestinian visibility within the West. So our efforts are all slipped back into this requirement to speak to the legitimacy and authenticity of the subject that we claim to be in solidarity with. And in fact, you lose the practice of solidarity in this gesture, that you lose all conversation around Palestine liberation when you're trying to prove that there's an actual object of solidarity through this neoliberal claim. These gestures place the figure of the queer Palestinian as a placeholder for transnational solidarity activism, representing the missing figure of that neoliberal calls to discourse require for the authentic other. Conversely, Palestinian queer activists through PQPDS, and as articulated by Haneen Mikki in her keynote address yesterday, mark a political subject position that intervenes into the mobilization of the figure of the queer Palestinian by articulating both the terms and conditions of transnational solidarity and disrupting the homogenizing logics that structure neoliberal sexual citizenship through discourses of sexual rights in state recognition. Unlike Joseph Massad's figure of the Gay International, which serves as a civilizing mission, queer solidarity through these other frameworks, such as in Kwaya's fight to march in the Pride Parade, mark a different set of interventions into the politics of Palestine-Israel. While the Gay International may seek to liberate the figure of the queer Palestinian from homophobia, interventions like those of Kwaya at Pride mark a tactical intervention into Israel's pinkwashing project. Further, Kwaya's gesture of solidarity with Palestinian queers is itself situated within a realm of a larger Palestine liberation movement and a larger Palestine solidarity movement, aligning in solidarity with the 2010 call for international queer support to the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in particular. So responding to this call from PQBDS, Kwaya's relationship of solidarity to Palestinian queers is mediated not through the fictional figure of a queer Palestinian, but through the political call from Palestinian queer activists to join the BDS movement in support of Palestinian civil society's call for an intervention into Israel's occupation of Palestine. The complex conditions of solidarity through which Kwaya articulated his politic reveals important considerations for thinking about the work of transnational queer solidarity activism more generally. Indeed, the claim to be in solidarity with queer Palestinians, activists must build relationships of solidarity across spatial and political locations on terms that are legible across these locations, not simply on models of representational solidarity that serve the interests of those activists located in places like Toronto, for example. Thus, as Kwaya insisted on the term Israeli apartheid, it obliged the public to contend with the contradictions in celebrating sexual rights simultaneous to the disregard of Palestinian human rights. In the attempt to ban the words Israeli apartheid from Pride, the irony of suggesting that Kwaya changed its messaging to ease the discomforts of Israel supporters elides the consistently invisible ways that occupation and apartheid precludes Palestinian rights. That the visibility and invisibility of queer Palestinians at Toronto Pride was constantly mediated through the homonationalist defense of Israel signals the importance of treading carefully in building and mobilizing solidarity. So I just want to say that in conclusion, I hope that the considerations of the tension between how solidarity activism is mobilized in this kind of case of Kwaya in Toronto really flags the extent to which the risk of how pinkwashing discourses, how neoliberal rights values restructure and risk producing kind of straw figures within social movements that replicate hierarchical and asymmetrical power dynamics within solidarity movements. And so this paper is a gesture not to simply condemn or criticize transnational solidarity activism, but instead to think really carefully about building meaningful and powerful connections across those movements. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next and last speaker is Naomi Brussel. She is a retired social worker who's also worked with people with AIDS from 1989 to 2008. As a political activist, she has focused in the past several years on Palestinian liberation work. She campaigned in 2010 and 2011 for the U.S. boat to Gaza and is a member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, as well as a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op, Members for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Welcome.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, hi. That's a long name, our group's name. I want to give you a general overview of the co-op itself, the food co-op, and the campaign that we were involved in, and the group that organized the campaign for BDS at the co-op, and then explain to you how some queer issues actually were involved in the organizing, although it was definitely not the focus of our work at all, but it came up a couple of times surprisingly and kind of frequently in various kinds of arguments and discourse with our opponents. So let me explain that the Park Slope Food Co-op Members for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions is a group that developed during the last 2.5 years. Our most dramatic moment so far was in March 27th, 2012, when our proposal for a co-op-wide referendum on boycotting Israeli goods came up to a vote in the largest Park Slope Food Co-op general meeting ever. 10% of the 16,000 members, and not everybody attends this meeting, believe me, voted, and the final count was 653 for a referendum and 1,005 against. That was about a 40% vote in our favor and 60% against what we were proposing to do. We lost the vote, but we had made it possible for thousands of members of the food co-op to talk about Palestine. It had been sort of an undiscussable issue, and it became even more enormously discussed in the New York City area. There was tremendous publicity about this vote. We had excellent support from the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which does a lot of helps groups with press connections, and we got multiple press inquiries. We were even featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. You can look for it. It was a small-time story with international implications, and many local politicians felt moved to comment on our campaign as well. The public advocate, who, by the way, is now running to be the mayor, said, quote, "The inflammatory proposal to boycott products from the State of Israel is wrong-headed and an affront to American values and interests." The mayor was quoted as saying, "I think it has nothing to do with food. The issue is there are people who want Israel to be torn apart and everybody to be massacred. And America is not going to let that happen." This really was in the New York Times, y'all. And almost every politician, local, within the New York City area felt that they had to say something. And community rabbis mobilized against us. Within the food co-op structure, we were intensely undermined by some paid staff, one in particular, who told members that voting against having a referendum was voting for the survival of the co-op. And he continued to say that we were in jeopardy of absolutely collapsing if we voted in favor of boycotting, of having a referendum. This was a vote about a vote, which was kind of hard to explain to people what we were about. But let me give you a little history of the co-op and of our BDS group so you can understand how and when the queer issues arose. The Park Slope Food Co-op is a 40-year-old worker-owned, worker-run food store. What began in 1973 as a small food-buying club has grown to more than 16,000 members. All members are required to pay a returnable $100 deposit and to do a 2 3/4-hour work shift once every 4 weeks. The co-op's founders came from the mostly white, politically radical, anti-Vietnam War generation of the late 60s and early 70s. Many cooperative groups began then with the goal of creating less oppressive institutions, such as ours, which is outside the normal food distribution system. And I want to tell you that if you live in the New York area and you can join, you will save an enormous amount of money because our prices are only 20% more than wholesale. And that's because we are all working in the co-op, giving our labor to it. So think about it, although it's not so easy to get in right now. Over the decades, the co-op developed a decision-making structure based on voting at monthly general meetings. Any member can attend, but there were rarely more than 30 people at these meetings in the past. And in the decade that has just passed, about 200 to 300 may attend because you can get work slot credit for going to the meeting. So still, that's just about 1% to 2% of the people who are members of the co-op. As a not-for-profit corporation, the co-op now has a 5-member elected board of directors who normally ratify any decisions made by the general meeting. I know this is a little, obscure, all of our rules and how we are structured, but it comes in, hopefully, to help you understand what happened in some of the incidents related to queer politics. However, there is also a hierarchical structure of about 50 employees, at the top of which are 9 general coordinators. And in practice, these 9 coordinators have accrued a lot of power because they oversee the day-to-day functioning of the co-op, and they can be involved in frequent policy decisions. The present Park Slope Food Co-op members for BDS began meeting in late 2010. It had been preceded, this group, by an earlier group which formed in early 2009 2009, after a concerned member called for a boycott of Israeli goods in January 2009 during the Israeli attack on Gaza, the cast-lead attack. This member met with a few others who approached her after this meeting, and in the next couple of months, they continued to meet, looking for a way to try to institute boycott, divestment, and sanctions at the co-op. She was quoted in an article in the Jewish Forward, which is a formerly radical Jewish newspaper in New York. I mean, formerly, we're talking about 100 years or so of it existing. I'm not sure the exact years. It's now a liberal, but Zionist. So I don't know if this is, it's possibly be liberal and Zionist publication. And so she agreed to be interviewed, and she was quoted there. And then later she was told that by a co-op staff member that the co-op had received a bomb threat on the phone about the proposal to boycott Israeli products. So she started to become concerned about her own personal safety, and she and another woman who'd been really central to this earlier group organizing for BDS dropped out, and that group kind of fell apart. In October 2010, a year and a half later, another BDS co-op group was formed, and it's the one which brought the March 27, 2010 referendum proposal to a vote, after a long process of preparation. And that group is continuing, although membership has changed during the 2.5 years. Okay, so the queer issue came up as an underlying theme in open arguments and discussions with our opponents. And there were also 2 incidents in our organizing that were queer-related. Part of our campaign, especially in the months before the general meeting vote, was to hand out leaflets to members at the entrance of the co-op. Often people who support Israel's policies were also leafleting there. We had many heated arguments with them and with members who disagreed with us. There was a tendency for some people to yell. Yelling was very common during this process. Our group tried not to yell because we didn't want to look crazy and divisive. But we were yelled at a lot. And at the meeting that I was just describing, the big meeting, the yelling was intense when anybody from our group came to the microphone to defend the idea that we should have a referendum about BDS. I have to say, just speaking from my own conjecture, that a lot of the yelling is coming from people who have terror that without Israel, they are on their way to the gas chambers. I really think that this is a fact for some of the people who react in general to any criticism of Israel and who react to the concept of BDS. So they called us stupid, crazy, anti-Jewish, self-hating. 2 of them made physical attacks on us, and there were some who genuinely wanted to debate. Some of the yellers and some of the debaters would say that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where gay people are safe. They cited Arabs and Hamas as hostile and dangerous to gay people. We would point out to the debaters that Palestinian LGBT people in Israel and the occupied territories are all subject to persecution, and that Palestinian LGBT groups support BDS. The first specifically queer-related incident in the run-up to the vote was a bizarre written attack on one of our activists. And I'd like you to, I just want to read to you his description of what happened. A guy named Isaac contacted me through my author website. The person who I'm talking about is an author. And the website contact is for context, readings, potential projects, etc., not for personal harassing messages. People are naturally expected to leave their contact info. Now, he searched me out after reading my letter in the Gazette. The Gazette is the newspaper of the co-op. It comes out every 2 weeks, and at this point, for the last couple of years, we have a regular section of letters to the editors that are about BDS. There are many people who object to that and say that we're wasting money and paper on having all these letters about BDS, both opposing and in favor of it. So this guy, this is according to my informant, he received an eerie message. Essentially, it was an "I know who you are" message, and although he couldn't trace the person who wrote this to him, here's the text of the message. This is Isaac's message. I just read an article that quoted you and a letter you wrote regarding the Park Slope Food Co-op and your support for a ban on Israeli-made products. Your position is laughable. You said economic engagement with the state of Israel gives it the means and muscle to oppress, destabilize, and colonize the Palestinian people. I'm sure you said much more, but I'm not here to blow apart your stupid, ignorant statement. I would merely like to comment on the fact that if you and your boyfriend and dog lived in Ramallah or Gaza, I'm not sure how welcome you would be. However, if you decide to shack up in Tel Aviv, you could participate in the annual Gay Pride Parade. Think about that, you moron. Now, this is the comment of the person who received that note. Apart from the personal, this was a strange political argument. How the hell could I be allowed to shack up in Tel Aviv? Can I emigrate to Israel or Ramallah or Gaza? It's a bizarre premise. And it doesn't respond to the main point I made about what economic engagement with Israel is allowing the state to do, occupy, destabilize, etc. This is what I wrote back in the Gazette. That's the paper of the co-op, referencing Isaac's attack on me. The idea that LGBT people of color take any of their rights for granted anywhere, by the way, the person who's writing this is a South Asian man, or of South Asian descent. He's saying that the fact that we take any of our rights for granted anywhere is simply presumptuous. However, support for LGBT and sexual rights in any society in no way invalidates the value of cross-national solidarity in the struggle against oppression, injustice, and occupation. In fact, those struggles are linked. I'd like to remind Isaac that many people in Israel feel the same way. It's with that lens that I and others who are not Palestinians speak up against the policies of the State of Israel in colonizing Palestinian society, culture, and resources, policies that affect LGBT and straight people alike. Odd that speaking up against its state oppression makes me stupid and moronic. So be it. I was taken aback that Isaac had taken the trouble to search for my personal contact information, and he left his message in such a way that he could not be traced. I interpret this message and the form it was delivered as barely veiled threat, and any further unsolicited contacts of this type will be reported directly to the police. I expect co-op management to also take a stand for the personal safety of its members and for the right to express one's political views in appropriate forms without risk of personal retaliation. So that was one incident. The second, specifically queer and clearly pinkwashing related incident, happened in the months following the vote about having a referendum. And this was, we were planning a special event for Gay Pride. It was June coming up. And this was the first one after the vote. We had done a series of other educational events at the co-op. So let me read, let's see. We sent this out as a letter. By the way, the letter that I just wrote, that I just read to you, was also published in the Gazette. We had proposed an event about Israeli pinkwashing, and we wanted to do it at the co-op. The pinkwashing event organizers wanted the program to include a discussion of a local example of pinkwashing at the New York City LGBT Center. You've probably heard about that. That groups were kicked out after a private funder to the center threatened to remove funding, and the center, up until February 15th of this year, banned any Palestinian support group opposing Israel's violation of international law. 3 weeks after the BDS group submitted the pinkwashing program, we were told that the two members of the hierarchy of the co-op, which is these 9 members who are the general coordinators, decided that we couldn't have the pinkwashing event because they said it would violate a principle of cooperative conduct because it would criticize the center. They explained that because the center does good and vital work, it cannot be criticized at the co-op, and the event would be canceled. So we had a big argument about this, but there was nothing we can do because of the undemocratic structure of the co-op, and we would have had to take on the entire structure of the co-op in order to do something about this particular problem. We did ask our supporters to object and to write to the co-op and to as well as call the co-op to protest. The guy who really led that process against us was the one who had said that the co-op would collapse if we had BDS at the co-op. So it was interesting that they were able to use, it was a very blunt and heavy-handed way to get at us, but they also used the banning of groups at the LGBT Center as a way to justify their suppression of speech at the food co-op. So that was just, they were kind of piggybacking on, bad behavior in another institution. So just to let you know, our campaign is continuing. I think we can expect other queer issues to arise, sometimes unexpectedly. We will be less surprised by them and hopefully more effective in coping with them as the process goes forward. And so we welcome your input. We welcome you to join the co-op and to join us in working for boycott, divestment, and sanctions there.
Thank you so much. I want to just pull out a few threads. Sarah had suggested that people chairing the panel do a little bit of moderation rather than a formal response. And then I would like to turn it over to the panelists to engage each other if they have any wish to, and then turn it over to the general audience after that. We've got a good half hour here for the rest of the session. I just wanted to just highlight a few things that really jumped out at me in Zohar's paper, this question of sense of responsibility and the extension around accountability, the way that you talked about removing oneself and resituating in terms of political position, as well as losing a sense of queerness as a tool of resistance and what it means to think about that as a means, not an end. And I was really struck, too, by your account of claiming radical ancestors. So I wanted to invite you to talk more about that if you're willing to. I also had a question at some point around the way that you're able to sort of recuperate some of that statement and not others, despite the fact that it has Zionism within it, and how you actually engage that and what that means to do that kind of work. In Dean's presentation, I was thinking more about the way that you put it, people who are willing to travel to the edge but won't go all the way, and what is it that holds people back. And what I heard you talking about is the fantasy that the law is going to save us, and then also the fixation or the attachment and hitching liberation politics still in the end to the nation state. And that question around goals themselves or visions being illegible, and that willingness to free ourselves up to even imagine other possibilities. And I think of that as crucial to the decolonial imaginary. And I think with the two examples that you used with prison abolition and settler colonialism, I mean, one thread I'd like to invite you to address if you're up for it is, what does it mean on the other side of prison abolition, or what does it mean to actually decolonize from settler colonialism? What does that even look like that makes people not want to go there, even in terms of being willing to talk about it or fantasize about it and dream about it? Mikki, with the paper, what really jumped out at me is the really rigorous attention to the colonial relationship, in terms of what you talked about as disorienting for people, in the rejection of gay rights as the point of reference and disturbing the order. And I really appreciate how several of the papers, especially yours in this case, really touched back on Haneen's keynote from yesterday to ask that question again. Is it solidarity with queer Palestinians or with Palestine? And that's one I hope that we can all take up in discussion in the Q&A. And also, if it's not about sexual solidarity, then what is the basis for rethinking different productive forms of solidarity that aren't about liberal inclusion? And in Natalie's piece, we saw, related to that, liberal discourse and neoliberal logics in terms of homonationalist solidarity, and thinking again about this question of legibility in the creation of a queer Palestinian or suffering queer Palestinian to actually make something visible to people who are resisting, allowing or trying to block or preempt or prevent or preclude Kwaya from participating. And then what does it mean? What are the risks involved and what gets reproduced in appealing to these logics to try and fight for the right to actually partake? And as you put it, what does it mean in the, sort of the moment of opting for a tactic? What is lost and what does that mean for solidarity? And with Naomi, with your account of the struggle at the co-op, I mean, it shows in another local example, and we've seen several of them or we heard about them in these presentations, is just how threatening this is to people, and also that pinkwashing can emerge when the question on the table is about a vote for the boycott of food products. And it shows how porous this is and how I think co-optable anything around sexual rights as the basis can just be melded in and infused in terms of trying to block that, and really also showing the emotional investments and sort of affective ties to sort of the structure of the co-op, which is supposed to be democratic, and then using the principles of the co-op to actually to stop the discussion itself is really striking. And so part of that is about even just the basis upon which people are able to levy a critique and insist upon opening up spaces to have these conversations. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists if you have any comments or questions for each other, and then we'll turn it over to you all. And also, we've got a floating mic, but I've been told that it's better if we can kind of share these and move them around in terms of feedback for the simulcast or live stream.
Well, I was struck by Natalie's discussion about what happened there, that there really were similarities, to how the dynamic goes in a particular community when you're finding about something. Although you were talking about queer issues, we weren't, but the way that the leverage that the Jewish right-wing organizations can place is very intense, and on the politicians as well as on whatever institutions we're trying to liberate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the similarities of stories across locations, and at least in the North American context, are very much. They echo each other in a lot of ways because the logics and discourses that are mobilized by the Pinkwashing project train, not just queer people to, be invested in the Israeli state through its, haven of gay rights, but in fact train, non-queers to use this argument as leverage in attacks on critics of Israel. And so this is actually a systemic and pervasive tactic that is being mobilized, and that this logic is at root, the ruling logic of how sexual rights comes to be mobilized, not just for the investment in the Israeli state, but also to undermine other kinds of projects and undermine the other kinds of goals. So for example, in the context of BDS debates, there's nothing in BDS that was saying anything about gay rights, but gay rights get used in the attack on, that person who received the letter, because, as part of this slippage that happens. And the slip is not just an accidental slip, it's actually the insidious slip of how the reality of those power relations are made invisible. So it's like an investment in continually erasing the reality of occupation and apartheid every time that those narratives around sexual rights are brought forward. And they all rely on this logic as well, that there are rights that are more important than others. Some rights are more important than others. That we have to value sexual rights above everything else. Mm-hmm. So those become other indicators. And I've heard a lot of people at this conference over the last 2 days give incredibly detailed and insightful accounts of these processes that work in lots of different practices and spaces. So like, it's been great being in here and connecting with everyone's stories that they've been telling through the academic and activist work they're doing. It's nice.
Yeah.
I want to maybe just say one thing to what you asked me, Kēhaulani.
Can you speak a little bit more?
Sure. I just was thinking about, you asked about people going up to the edge, and I was thinking about how sometimes I think people will talk about, people will look at the history of like the anti-domestic violence movement in the US and see the ways in which it became like, people will use the word co-opted to become a pro-criminalization framework, or people will say that about lesbian gay rights and how it becomes pro-criminalization or you know, pro-US imperialism. And I think the problem with the word co-opted is that it suggests that it had some capacity to be anti-criminalization or anti-colonial and like lost it somewhere. And I think the problem is actually that structure, the way it was built, never had an investment. So that's what I feel like, and that's, you know, in the story I'm telling about the jail in Seattle, it's like when I'm engaging with these, you know, youth criminal justice reformers and child welfare reformers who attest to really like, you know, they're the ones who like develop really great analysis of how truly racist this system is and the ways that it separates Native children from their families and communities, and then they still think it should exist. It's because there actually is an existing framework for doing all of that work and not having an anti-colonial or anti-criminalization principle. That's deep. You know what I mean? Like that. So it's like the question in some ways is, what do we have to do to dismantle and rebuild? You know, what is it about the service provider role, about the academic role, all these roles that people can go to some edge with you, it seems like, but you actually weren't even traveling on the same road, perhaps. And I think that there's these intense fears that underlie protection of these institutions, and protection, so that even somebody who tells me they're anti-marriage and not Zionist is still going to protect the pinkwashing tour that's coming through the town, and like fight like hell and stand beside, you know, racist groups like Stand With Us, to do so. And I think that those deep fears are about how these systems, and I think you said this in some ways too, Naomi, about how they promise safety. Certainly that's the promise of the prison, and it's wrapped up in all these racist imaginaries and all of these medicalized imaginaries. I mean, so much in there, much of which we've been talking about at this conference. And I think that the counter to that we're all constantly developing, practicing, and talking about is a different set of beliefs, like that there aren't bad guys is like a huge one. Like that takes our child selves have to be like, wait, everything I learned was wrong. Every book I ever read was a lie. Every movie. What if there aren't bad guys? What if all of the kind of bases for the fears aren't true? What if violence has systemic root causes? What if we actually all know how to prevent violence in various ways, how to change our own behaviors, how to forgive each other? Like, these are all things we are told are impossible, and that punishment is the only answer. What if mutual aid is a human characteristic more than greed? You know, I think that some of the logics that students who come in my classrooms often have is that, I've been told this by students, it feels kind of, I hope it's not harmful to say this out loud because it's so awful, that sort of people always warred for land and it's just that the Europeans won it. Like these kinds of logics that are just so incredibly horrifying, that are about believing that people are truly horrible and greedy and like violent. So I think there's a lot of that we're unpacking too, about what we believe about each other and then how we practice it day to day, and how we notice we've practiced it all along too. That colonization processes, criminalization processes have never been total. And so then it's like, how do we find and share the alternatives?
It reminds me of when the Obama administration finally endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, which was passed by the General Assembly in 2007, and he endorsed it, I believe, in late 2010 in December. And immediately all the right-wing pundits were like, what is this going to do? Give Manhattan back to the Indians? And they didn't know the name of the indigenous people, but that was beside the point. But use that as like, you see that as a point of reference for the right. But even, you know, this question around land and the anxiety of land in terms of people who are engaged in, never mind liberals, but just radicals engaged in that. When you get to something like land, I think that comes to that question of what do they want, right? What do they really want? And then it just sort of goes to this extreme instead of thinking through rebuilding relationships. And in a different example that wasn't even about land, Joanne Barker, who I mentioned earlier on her blog, Tequila Sovereign, who was talking about Occupy Wall Street and the actual street at Occupy Wall Street where the wall used to be that the Dutch built to keep out the Lenape and the English settlers. Now it was torn down and made into Wall Street by the English. She took part in the Occupy Oakland insistence with other indigenous people living on Chochenyo-Ohlone lands in present-day Oakland, and they pushed for decolonize Oakland as a name, and the vote happened and people did it, but she writes a sort of a post-vote account where people were really uncomfortable with it and basically said, well, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean for me? Like, what do we have to do now? And so again, that kind of resistance to thinking through what it actually means to re-envision a relationship in solidarity, but also in recognition of indigenous peoples whose land we're on. So I'm thinking of that with the settler colonial example.
And I think that there's, something about this dual move of rethinking the really fundamental emotional and political things that move us, and the way that does get connected and got connected in all of the papers, to envisioning something that we can't even quite grasp, and to insisting on envisioning that even before we can grasp it, in the way that, that history that we don't quite have will connect to the future we can't quite see yet, but that it's really a way of blowing things wide open and then put together with really concrete, critical struggles, if it's, food, or, to tie these really kind of wide concepts and questioning into really concrete practices is something that I think you've all given me like real tools to think about.
Okay, shall we open it up to the audience then? Why don't you do that? Or now you mean, or no, at the end? Okay, we'll have to remember. Okay, good. Please remind me. Yes, hello. Actually, that'd be great, and it'd be good for those who may be watching this. There's another microphone on this side as well, if anybody wants to queue up.
Okay, too tall.
How you doing there?
Okay, so my question is for Dean. As I was listening to your presentation, I felt like law functioned as a form of excess in your framing, insofar as it's like an overaccumulation, right? And also as its application always goes beyond the written word in and of itself. So this is where I see the excess, and then the desire for governmentality is perhaps a desire for containment, a sense of vertigo, or maybe like, I don't know, like being overwhelmed that forces this kind of containment, and that makes, forces someone who's at the edge essentially to like turn around and go back. So that's how I see as containment. So in that sense, like the law is never the stability that it claims to embody. It's always unstable. So I was wondering if you could speak to that dichotomy between its radical instability and its face or its aesthetic as something that's perfectly stable and perfectly well, objective, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I all the time I'm just like, what even is the law? Is like the real question for me at this point. But I think a lot about how utterly lawless the kinds of systems of violence that we're all talking about are, right? Like we all know, like cops can do whatever they want to anybody, and the like. You know what I mean? Like they can just take anybody in whenever they are ready, and then let them out or beat them up or whatever. You know, like there's just the realities of lawlessness, and certainly like we can see this playing out every single day in terms of the Israeli military. And I wonder about and yet I was just actually in my class, we just taught a piece about the idea that the Israeli military is a moral military and has like this moral code, right? Like what do these things actually do, and how do our fantasies attach to them? And I think that the instability of law, like what's wild about it is how it doesn't matter, like how everybody knows that everybody breaks the law all the time, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you get caught. What matters is like who your parents are or what kind of school you went to, when there's a police station in it, you know, like that. I don't know what to do with that. Because of the intense fantasies around law. And one of the things that's actually a struggle for me as somebody working in solidarity with Palestine is the way that all the talking points are about human rights. Like so many talking points that other solidarity activists are using are about human rights. And I don't use those talking points about domestic struggles I'm involved in because it doesn't mean much to me, because where are human rights enacted? Like, what is, you know, like, where is that, what is that fantasy about? And yet, obviously, it's incredibly meaningful, and I think Kēhaulani's work shows this, that even if we have doubts about law enforcement, it's essential to always notice when, the extreme violation of international law is like worth noting always. That's really significant because it's part of the story we need to tell about the ways that legal systems break their own rules constantly to engage violence. But I think that that fantasy of the stability of law and of law enforcement, it's also just like heartbreaking. Like for me as a poverty lawyer, just people coming in and they're just like, this wrong thing happened to me. And the answer is almost always like, the system can't see it, you have no pathway, or even though you're completely right in the written law, it'll never matter. Like that's just the reality of what these systems of violence are. And how do we break the spell? I mean, that's, I think, what I spend a lot of time thinking about also in my classes full of law students. Like, how do we break the spell of that fantasy? I'm not sure. Obviously, it's like lots of little strategic moves within things. And part of what I'm trying to say always is that people can still make law reform demands in ways that are strategic. Like you can be trying to get rid of a 3 strikes law in your state, and it can still be a meaningful intervention it is still a dismantling move, and we have to kind of do that analysis all the time. But I think, like, how do we have movements that actually understand the true lawlessness of law enforcement and militarism so that we can not have, not fall into some of the reform traps or not have some of the extreme disappointments when the human rights are won and then you still never see, material shift.
Could you speak at the mic, please?
It's been a great discussion, and it's been really interesting hearing what the pinkwashing activists have done to fight against Israeli occupation of Palestine. I've been surprised. I've been looking for critiques of the U.S. as the biggest pinkwasher in the world, and about its attempts to use pinkwashing to support continual wars in the Middle East. And I was wondering, I haven't heard any queer organizing, anti-war organizing for like Iraq, Libya, Syria, like that. And I was just wondering if people knew of any.
I mean, there are queer people in all movements, so there isn't, an explicitly pinkwashing agenda that's being mobilized, for example, in Syria. So there's no anti-pinkwashing response in that dynamic. I think what makes the case of the Israeli state and its occupation of an apartheid system, like the occupation of Palestine as an apartheid system, is that it particularly mobilizes sexual rights in its project in an international context explicitly. So I think that's the distinction for the kind of movement building I'm talking about in relation to other anti-war efforts. And I mean, I can just say that in Toronto, the people that I work with in Queers Against Israeli Apartheid have all been part of other anti-war, anti-occupation, anti-violent movements. A lot of our members were part of anti-South African apartheid movements as well. And so, sometimes those movements engage in a kind of queer politic in a particular way, but I don't think queer is a necessary inclusion within any particular kind of politic, especially when there's not a real reason for those to be included in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I was talking more about like struggles where there was it explicitly like the U.S. is saying like, oh, it's really good for gay people. Libya is much better now for women and gay people, or Iraq is much better now for women and gay and lesbian people and Christians and all the other bullshit that's.
I mean, I can say from in a Canadian context, when Canada participated in the war of Afghanistan, our government said that it was to liberate Afghani women, and feminists across Canada said, like, that's bullshit. So, they engaged in the anti-war movement. I think in those moments, like, people are actively involved in those. So, yes, yeah.
And also the woman-saving discourse, which doesn't include LGBT, right? Yeah, so. Could you go to the mic, please?
So, Dean, I was really struck when you said that there's certain worlds that we're not allowed to imagine. And it took me, in thinking about the ways in which pinkwashing lines up with Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism thesis, and I hope I do justice in sort of summarizing it, but she sort of describes cruel optimism as a kind of relation in which one depends on objects and fantasies that actually blocks the very thriving that motivated our attachment to those objects and fantasies in the first place. So our habits and rituals, rights, marriage, the military, industry, jails, identities, and our nationalisms play off our fantasies of the good life, but in such a way that it keeps us from actually flourishing. And so I was wondering, because you all have been involved in really important movements, and thank you for sharing those, how did you get to the point in your movements where you were actually able to imagine or reimagine different worlds? How did we get to that point?
I can go ahead. I mean, I'm really interested in imagining different worlds. I think it's something I'm really interested in how we think about. I think there are a lot of ways that activists think about different worlds. I mean, we have like utopian visions of the future. We have apocalyptic imaginings of the future. There's all kinds of modes of futurity that we can try and envision. My own personal investments are to think about the near future. So to think about our present and what we can do now to make a difference for something very close to us. And that instead of imagining, you know, an ideal world where everything is happy and everything is free, to think about what world I can make tomorrow, and then tomorrow what world I can make the day after that, in order to increasingly address the ways that, you know, power circulates in and finds new holds, where new forms and new logics start to be used in ways that exploit people and expel people and enact violence on people's bodies. And, you know, so I think like pinkwashing, for example, I mean, pinkwashing is meaningless if we are able to succeed in this movement, right? And then we can move on to another kind of framework of analysis. I think right now, this is the new language that's being used and launched. So, you know, my vision of the world is one where, you know, the terms of BDS at least are met. And then let's work on the next project when we get to that point.
Yeah, for me, it's a very beautiful question to pose, what we dare ourselves to imagine. And I think I don't have the answer to your question, obviously, but one of the primary steps for me would be to think of how can we create spaces, small spaces, large places, in which we are even allowed to imagine, and in which we can have the conversations that we want to have. And then within the activist world, within movement building, to think through how can we both respond to discourse and to incitement to discourse, while at the same time allowing for different forms of recognition, and take responsibility also in finding ways of recognizing struggles that do not operate through juridicalized forms of humanity. And these are like small steps, and I think it's a very complex and multiple struggle, but I think these small spaces where we can have alternative conversations would be an opportunity. Oh, you have one, sorry.
I'll just add one thing to this too. I think sometimes in conversations about prison abolition, since that's what I've been focusing on in this talk, people will be like afraid to say, let's just close all the prisons and fire all the cops from their jobs right now. And I think it's really important to actually just say that, even just to be like, overall, if we look at if we could have like a total graph of all the violence, there would be less violence then. And I think that people have this extreme fear that's like, well, no, we don't mean that, you know? And I think that maybe the right of return or the abolition entirely of the Israeli military, right away, what would that be like? And I think that those are very, it's good for us to spend time, especially in our activist spaces, talking about what comes up for people around that, and really forming some thoughts around what that looks like. If they opened up all the doors to all the New York State prisons right now and everyone could walk away, first just things also how do we make sure people got home? And, and how do we make sure everybody was okay? And, what if, you know what I mean? All of it. and so that we could, I don't know, I think it just really shifts it from the kind of like, oh no, we're still going to imagine like some state caretaker somehow helping us transition to the new world, which just sounds like, forever deferred management of the violence to me.
The part about how we got to envisioning these other worlds, I think for me is so clearly desperation, and pessimism and a feeling of being completely lost and clueless, and there's no, slogan I can fit on a sticker or on a T-shirt or in a 12-minute talk. This feeling of like, I have no idea what needs to be done, what I can do. But I think that has been huge in extricating me from a kind of dialogue mode or coexistence mode, or also all of these things that are so completely, shattered, but have started through that shattering to open, the idea of like, it's going to be totally different, and I'm just sort of slowly, starting to prepare for what that might look like. And I think, being in these conversations is part of that, and being willing to be afraid is part of that, being willing to let go of fears that, like you mentioned, is part of that. But it's all, for me, super raw, and so not there yet, but just being willing to figure out each action from within that very, very lost point is a strategy. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry too. It is very grim. This stage of the collapse of capitalism is very grim to live through, and I'm older than a lot of people in this room and than anyone on this panel. And so I would say I used to be more, I didn't see things as clearly, and things didn't look as horrible as they tend to look. But I feel like that the way is to continue to do the work and to continue to try to understand what is preventing us from changing things, and that's where the hope is, or that's where I see possibilities. And I do believe that things change, because they do. They always change. Sometimes for the worse, but they change, and they can change, and that means that we can make them change.
We want more. We want more.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Okay, yeah. So we're at the 5 o'clock hour now, and I don't see anyone queued up, so I hope I'm not cutting anybody off. Also, Natalie has an announcement, and then we'll have a break, and then we come back at 7. What's that? 6:30. Pardon me, 6:30 for the keynote. Natalie?
So a lot of us at the table are part of a movement of activists from like all over the place who are working in a loose network to do anti-pinkwashing activism. And so some of us are like in local groups, and some of us are just like doing international organizing with this network. And we've got a campaign that we're trying to launch. We're building the pilot right now, but we're hoping that people from the conference might be interested in participating by joining the call to boycott gay tourism to Israel and making a video to upload on a website giving your reasons why. So we've got these like flyers that have information on how to do it and like examples of what you can say. For example, I will not party in Tel Aviv because clubs and beaches can't hide the violence of occupation and apartheid. So that's an example of one. Anyway, I have flyers, and I'll bring them out, hand them out after, and please take some if you're interested in that, and to pass them around to people that you know. We're gonna try and get a website up and going in the next week or so too. All right, thanks.
And thanks to all our panelists.